Hey, I figured that we all could use a little bit of a pick me up. So I decided to give a call to my buddies over at the Maui Nui Seabird Recovery Project on the island of Maui in the island chain of Hawaii to talk to them about the work that they're doing to protect seabirds. What these guys are up to is so inspiring and all of the good feels, and I really hope you enjoy it.
We are driving just on a dirt road. There's no traffic or anything. We're just going up to
That better? So I'm Marty Frye. I'm the field crew leader for Maui Nui Seabird Recovery Project. And we're here in the field at our Makamaka Ole endangered seabird mitigation site. I'm here with Josh DeCambra. He's our newest crew member, joining us through the Kupu Aina Corps program, which is a wonderful program that is taking CARES Act money from the pandemic stimulus and pumping it into green jobs. And this site where we're standing it's offsetting the endangered seabird mortalities from a wind farm that's located on West Maui. The wind farm has permission from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the state of Hawaii DLNR. They have permission for the take of endangered seabirds that's caused inadvertently from the operation of their wind turbines. And in order to comply with the federal legislation like the Endangered Species Act, they have to do mitigation activities to offset that take. And so about 9 years ago or so, I think 2013, they started the construction of two predator-proof exclosures, which are behind me. Those exclosures provide safe habitat for A'o and Ua'u, the Newell shearwater and the Hawaiian petrel, which are two critically endangered seabirds. They're nocturnal seabirds. They used to nest at all elevations and all habitats on the islands. They've been relegated to like mountainous terrain because they find less pressure from introduced mammals there on the steep cliffs. And then the high elevation habitat on Haleakala, there's fewer cats, fewer rats, mongoose, goats, pigs, dogs, cows even. So they're able to persist there, even though they're in what we'd call embattled colonies, or they've been relegated to these sort of more marginal locations and largely extirpated from their former habitat. So that's what we're doing here. We took over the management of this site a couple years ago, and we're dealing a lot with corrosion, erosion, and wind damage on the fence infrastructure. And so we're making repairs to the fence while continuing to monitor and manage the site. We did make some changes to the nest boxes. There's 50 artificial nest boxes in each of the exclosures. And so we insulated some of them more from temperature fluctuations. We changed the substrate to a softer substrate, and we also made changes to the playback system, which it's broadcasting the vocalizations of each of these two birds in their respective exclosures. And with those changes and the 9th year of the site, last year we saw the first chick fledge from anywhere in Maui County, and I don't know how long. It's been decades since there was a documented nest, and that is due to the social attraction site here. The birds were not nesting here before; they were attracted here, tempted to land and start nesting because of the broadcast system that's playing their vocalizations, and then there's also wooden painted bird decoys scattered around outside the nest boxes. So they found it adequate enough to land and start breeding activity here some years ago now. And last year, all of that culminated in finally the first chick.
Whoa, that's so cool. I wouldn't imagine that you guys would be playing recordings of birds to attract birds. For
Yeah,
people that
it's
don't know, oh yeah, sorry.
no, I
Go
was going to
ahead.
say that's something that's been used, being used more and more. It's easiest, when you have a colonial nesting species. These seabirds that we're working with, they're highly phylopatric. They always return return to their breeding to their where they were born in order to do their breeding. So you can kind of take advantage of that. If you can get some to pull over and start breeding somewhere, then they're always going to return there, and their chicks will as well. So you can kind of start a little colony if you can convince them to start nesting.
So cool. For people that don't know, I guess, could you provide a definition of what a seabird is and why seabirds in Hawaii may be different from seabirds in other places?
Okay, so yeah, the question, Josh, what is a seabird? We had spoken about this a little earlier, and Josh said it's going to be a bird that mostly lives out to sea and is only seen around land for breeding purposes. In other words, they're not getting food and water here; they just need terra firma to lay an egg and raise a chick. And so, yeah, here in Hawaii, there's been a lot of loss of native wildlife, and that can cause people to really wonder about, where is the native wildlife? Why aren't there more seabirds? We're in the middle of the ocean. When you're on, let's say, the mainland United States, you encounter tons of wildlife like seagulls and cormorants and pelicans, and they're also seabirds for sure. They use the ocean. They're birds whose habitat includes the ocean. But we don't really have seagulls here unless they're sort of either wayward or maybe overwintering or vagrant birds. And I think part of the reason for that might be that we're so far in the deep ocean. There's not any continental landmass anywhere near here. So some of those seabird species that aren't really utilizing the deep ocean might not be birds that you would really see here. And so the birds that our organization is working with mostly are what we call pelagic seabirds. They're using the deep ocean, and like I said, with Josh's first reply, they're mostly out to sea, and so that's like the simplest definition of a seabird. But there's a lot of other ways to talk about them too, because they are literally our ancestors. In Hawaii, you have this concept of kupuna. People talk about, a lot of times they're referring to elderly people as kupuna, or ancestors. And that's because those are the people who pass down information about how to live. They pass down stories about who we are, and they're the the important references for a culture. And I still like to, even though I'm not Hawaiian in any way, any shred, I still think it's important that we hold up these concepts and point to how they are literally true as well. It's seabirds are literally our ancestors. You can talk about other organisms aside from people being kupuna, because they fulfill a lot of those same roles as people. They came before us. They show us how to live, and they are involved in all the stories that tell us who we are. So for seabirds here, their genetic ancestry goes back 70 million years. They played a role in the formation of the soils that sustain life, because we're on volcanic rocks, and it takes millions of years for organic soil to develop. Without any inputs, it couldn't develop. And seabirds are what provided those inputs. Maui is a 2 million year old, approximately 2 million year old island. And so to the extent that there's built up organic material and soil here, that's because seabirds brought it over those 2 million years. So another way that seabirds are ancestors is that they teach us. They're just like kupuna, that show us and teach us about our place and what our role should be in that place. And so once you realize that they created the soil here, it changes a lot about about how you think about them. And oftentimes because of our role doing seabird conservation, we are working in areas where there used to be seabirds and where we want there to be seabirds again. We're trying to return them to an ecological niche, that role that they play as engineers of the soil. And so when we go into places, and we have lots of stories of this from our colleagues and other people around the state too, is you have examples where people started doing management. They started pulling invasive trees off of a coastline, doing vegetation work, and the birds responded. The birds chose that place to start nesting after the management occurred. They affirmed that management or that care that was given to that place. And we even had one where a new bird arrived. This was just last year on Molokai. A new breeding bird arrived in a place that had been being taken cared for, and it dug a burrow. But in the inside of that burrow were really old bones of birds, and so it was a new burrow, but it was the bird had chosen an old place. And the managers of that, the caretakers of that place, were hoping that seabirds would come nest there. That was one of their goals, but they weren't totally aware at the time that there were bird bones right under their feet. So the bird that dug that burrow showed them that. It taught them that. And birds are constantly teaching us those types of lessons by showing us what they need and responding when we do that.
That is so cool. Could you introduce what the Maui Nui Seabird Recovery Project is and why you're both involved?
Okay, so the Maui Nui Seabird Recovery Project, it's a project of the University of Hawaii at Manoa Pacific Cooperative Studies Unit, which is a unit within the university that engages in a lot of different conservation-oriented projects. There's watershed partnerships, invasive species committees, seabird restoration, forest bird restoration. There's planned extinction prevention. There's all manner of projects within this university bureaucracy, and we fall in that. We are also agents of the state. We work on behalf of the Department of Land and Natural Resources in Hawaii. So we're fulfilling the state's mandate to monitor and protect native seabirds. The project started in 2006. It was the concept of Dr. Fern Duvall. He was working in the state Department of Land and Natural Resources, only just retired this December, and actually, unfortunately, passed away last week, leaving behind a large legacy of conservation, not just of birds, but of whole landscapes as well. And so in 2006, Fern selected Jay Penniman as the first manager of this project, and they set out mostly on Lanai. At first, they were documenting the size and extent of the Ua'u colony on Lanai Hale, which turned out to be probably the second largest colony in the world of that species. And they worked there removing invasive plants, mostly strawberry guava, and trying to improve the habitat for the birds while also protecting them from non-native predators, and then monitoring the impact of those management decisions. Until 2012, they worked there, and that was when Larry Ellison bought Lanai, and he set up an organization that essentially replaced what Jay and Fern and their group had been doing. So at that point, the project had already been looking at seabird projects on Maui and had already been collaborating with people on other islands as well. So it shifted and became more based on Maui and more focused on the Maui and the other islands in Maui County, Kaho'olawe and Molokai as well. So since 2012, that's what we've been doing, documenting the locations of extant seabird populations in these remote mountain areas, trying to find out if they're in places that we could protect them, looking for places where we could attract the birds into and protect the birds from that standpoint, rather than going out to them, but finding places that could be protected from predators and then attracting the birds in. That's kind of like where we are now at Makamaka'ole. And we've also collaborated and done a ton of other work. We do education and outreach. We try to promote the idea of the importance of a dark nighttime sky, try to promote the idea of keeping pets indoors, try to, yeah, bring seabirds into more people's awareness. I think it's a little tricky because they're a species that's on land at nighttime, and they spend most of their life way far away at sea, away from people. And so they're not always right up in front and obvious for everybody, to keep in their awareness. But at the same time, they go back so far and have such deep ties to the place that every time we get a chance to talk to somebody about them, we have pretty positive results. And so it's still a tough job, though, because people have a lot of competing interests, for their time, their emotions, and their money. And so it is a big challenge for sure to, kind of champion the native species that aren't right up in your face, and also try and promote the, conceptualization of them that makes people the steward without being too much in control or dominating. We need to let wild animals back into their habitats and let them, do what it is that they do. They do provide us services. So it's not so much, like a garden that you're trying to grow and tend and control, but you are needing to do management or care. They talk about malama aina here. I think that's the best version of that concept, where you're a caring steward of a place.
I'm curious why a night sky that's dark is important for a seabird.
Yeah, that's really good. People have a lot of times heard about how nighttime light affects turtles, like sea turtles and other marine life, and those are great places to start from to talk about that, because it's really plain and simple with the turtles. They hatch from a beach and they have to go just like a short ways to get to the ocean. But there are these documented instances where there was a street light that essentially attracted them and directed them away from the ocean. And instead, the turtles went towards the light. And the reason why that's a really kind of nice and tidy story is because in those cases, there was really one light that was doing all the distraction. And so all that was needed to make a simple study and find the results from that was to change the light, to change the one light. And instead of going to the street light, the turtles would go to the ocean. So it turned out that it's the short wavelength content of the light. It's a spectral content that is you can think about it like the cooler colors, blue and white, instead of orange and red, which are those warmer colors that have a longer wavelength on the spectrum of light. So with seabirds, it's a little harder to get that direct causation, because if you think about a shoreline where seabirds are flying, it's not one light that's doing all the distraction. So you can't just go change out the one light and then see the results. But there are people that are researching and finding novel ways to show how seabird distraction works. And we basically know enough to go ahead and change our best practices. We should be promoting the idea of a dark sky. And you can achieve that by having outdoor lighting fixtures directed downwards. You can achieve that by having outdoor lighting fixtures shielded. You can even change the actual lights themselves so they filter out those short wavelengths. And a lot of other research has been piling on that shows that it's not good for plants, it's not good for people either, to have short wavelength on our bodies at nighttime. And that's because we evolved with sunlit days and dark nights, and all of our bodies are adjusted to that circadian rhythm. And that's informed by the ambient, the environment. So it's informed by the light that our bodies are exposed to. And it's the same for seabirds. The real big push for getting a dark sky in seabird areas is because when the birds are trying to fly out to the sea, they just do a U-turn and wind up in the Target parking lot or at the Taco Bell or at the airport or in just all manner of places where they're really in harm's way. And so when the Seabird project was started back in 2006, there was a small group of people. They were actually from Haleakala National Park here on Maui, and they were doing seabird recovery when fledgling birds mostly, getting distracted. It was guys from working at the park that had familiarity with the Hawaiian petrel, because that's where the largest colony in the world is. So they knew about that, and they were carrying out seabird recovery for a number of years. Once our project got online, we took over the seabird fallout recovery effort, and now that's another huge component of what MNSRP does. We have a 24-hour hotline when seabirds are located around town, and they're downed birds. We go recover them and assess them, enter all their data into the appropriate databases, and then we can band and even release the birds. And we have over a 20-year banded bird data set that includes these recovered fallout birds, like the one that you and your dad saw being released. But there's another data set that is it's recaptured birds, and we go into for example, for the Waukani, this is the bird that you guys saw being released in the story, where we've been monitoring those colonies, and even before our project, Fern and others were monitoring those colonies, recapturing birds and breeding their bands, and then in the fall going out and banding the chicks even. So now we have this like 2 decades old data set. And Cece, who we just saw drive by right before we started the interview, she went and looked into that and matched some of the birds that were fallout recovered birds that were like the one you and your dad saw that got released. Well, birds like that have showed up in the breeding colonies, during breeding season years later. Like on average, I think for Maui, the birds are coming, they're being recaptured back on land like 7 years after they fledge. So they're going out to sea as chicks. They're living on the ocean for anywhere from 2 to 7 years, getting mature, sexually mature, understanding how to find food and how to live there. And then once they're ready, they return to land, and that's when they start the whole process over again, and breed themselves. But we're finding that the recovered fallout chicks do return to colonies years later. So those efforts are worthwhile. They can be considered a success because those birds came back.
Amazing. Am I hearing birds right now? Is that?
Yeah. So we're standing in it's probably a mesic environment. I don't know how much it rains here a year, like 100 inches or something. We're in a dry spell right now. So yeah, you're hearing forest birds. We're on Windward Maui, and this area is pretty heavily impacted. It's been ranched here. And then right where I'm standing, and then this hillside behind me and the mountains that go up that way, they're part of a natural area reserve called the Kahakuloa Natural Area Reserve here. So yeah, there's some native forest birds. We've had apapane here. I think right when you spoke, it was a red-billed deothrix. I got my headphones in. But red-billed deothrix, non-native, Japanese bush warbler, non-native, the warbling white-eye, that's another non-native. We have the one native species here that I see every day is apapane. And yeah, that was red-billed deothrix, if you just heard that one. Every once in a while, when we're working here, we'll have a kea fly over, and that's the white-tailed tropic bird. We've had that fairly often happen. They're a daytime seabird, so unlike the shearwaters and petrels like we've been working with, the tropic birds, they're visible, flying around over land during the day when they transit out to the ocean to go forage and stuff, and then they're residents here. And so kind of year round, you can see them going to and from.
What attracted you to work for this project? Like, what made it appealing to work with seabirds?
Hey, so we got another question, Josh.
I mean, they're like how Marty said, they're freaking they're cool, and I don't know, like I don't know too much about them, and I just find them interesting, and just learning all I can. The more I learn, the more appreciation and respect I share for seabirds.